My name is Meredith Brafelson, or Meredith Lowden. That's my married name. My project was on the spatial relationship between demographics and brownfields in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania. I took a similar project that was done in Applied GIS and adapted it to my project. So a little overview. So I'm going to go into some background on what brownfields are. I'm going to also talk about the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Philadelphia County, where I got my data, the methods, the results, and some of the conclusions. So a little background on brownfields for those that don't know what a brownfield is. So by definition, a brownfield is a property that was once used for industrial purposes, but may now be contaminated due to previous use. And that is something that a lot of people don't realize are really in their backyard. So a lot of industrial areas that once were, in the 60s and the 50s were used for industrial purposes may no longer be used, so they might be vacant land. Other examples of brownfields are gas stations, abandoned gas stations where they could have had gas leaks just from gas being on site. Additionally, car mechanics where they have oil and they dispose of oil into the ground before it was regulated. So those are some examples of what brownfields are. And not all of those examples I gave are brownfields or classified as brownfields, but those are just common areas that are usually brownfields in the future. So the US EPA established the Brownfield program, and this allows for grant money to be given to states to clean up these areas and then be reused. And in Pennsylvania specifically, where I focused my project on, Pennsylvania defines brownfields as land recycling locations, and they break down these locations based on contamination. So the contamination is usually in the soil, the groundwater, the surface water, the waste, the sediment, or the air. And sometimes, there's multiple, so you could have an area that is contaminated with soil and groundwater, surface water. It could be if it's near a large body of water, and then air. Air is not as frequent, but usually you have soil and groundwater both being contaminated at a brownfield site. So the PADP, which is the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, established the Act 2 guidelines, and these Act 2 guidelines help them determine whether or not an area is deemed contaminated. This was put into place in the 70s when CERCLA was established. So CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And this helps provide funding for the PADP to clean up these locations. And when a active site is, put in place as active, that means that one of the 6 medium types exceeds the Act 2 guidelines. And these Act 2 guidelines are usually numbers that the soil has to meet. So, an environmental consultant would go out and test the soil, the groundwater, they would send it to the lab and then get results. And then if that exceeded the Act 2 guidelines, it would be deemed contaminated. And the purpose of this is to protect human health and the environment. And in the long run, it would be beneficial to everyone because it helps repurpose these areas. And a lot of times brownfields are repurposed for commercials, parks, housing, recreation, but majority it's like parks, because housing and recreation are harder to get approved to have people live there. So a little background on Philadelphia County. Philadelphia County is in Pennsylvania, and it's one of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. and it was one of the 3 original counties established. It's a little confusing because Philadelphia County is also home to the city of Philadelphia. So the city of Philadelphia resides within Philadelphia County. The city of Philadelphia is the 6th most populated city in the United States, and it's the most populated city in Pennsylvania. And it's where I grew up outside of, so I'm very familiar with this area and a huge Philly sports fan. So where I got my data to understand if there was a relationship between environmental contamination and demographics was, first, I got demographic information from the United States Census Bureau. And this data, the most up-to-date data was in 2019. And the 3 demographics that I chose for my project to look at were the African American population, average household income, and poverty status. And when I downloaded this data, because this is all public data, I had to filter it out based on the 3 demographics I wanted to use. So that was one of the hardest parts for me, because average household income and poverty status weren't as straightforward as the African American population, where I had to really understand whether or not the numbers were making sense to how I wanted to display them. The other areas that I downloaded data from were Pennsylvania Spatial Data Access. That's where I got my county boundaries. Philadelphia has open map data online. That is where I got some miscellaneous map features, such as different areas of the county, rivers, etc. And then the last part, which was where I got my land recycling location. PADP also has an open source GIS database where I was able to download the land recycling locations. And these land recycling locations I downloaded in January of 2022. So they were the most up to date, and those gave me the points of where contamination was based on soil, air, waste, groundwater, surface water, and sediment. So some of the methods that I did was I used ArcGIS Pro as my main method to display this information. So this allowed me to show the spatial relationship by using bivariate choropleth maps. Then I also, had to break down my demographics. So I had to decide what demographics I really wanted to look at. And then once I decided that, I was able to separate the figures to show the counts. And then everything was summarized to show the bivariate relationships. So the bivariate relationships couldn't be done until I figured out my demographics. I separated that out individually, and then I was able to summarize them all together. So this is just a reference map of Philadelphia County for those that are not familiar. And this is just some, rivers and some major roads within the county, and it sits in the eastern part of the state of Pennsylvania. So land recycling locations, this is all the land recycling locations within Philadelphia County. There was only 4 of the 6 media types identified within the county. So when I downloaded the data for the state, I clipped it just to be within Philadelphia County. And you can see that it looks like there's a ton. So for somebody that lives in Philadelphia County, they may have no idea that all these sites are within their backyard. And another note is that not all of these sites identified are active. So they're not all active sites, but at one point they were active. And then this table breaks down the amount of active versus inactive and the type of each one. So soil contamination is the main driver within the county. So then next I looked at land recycle locations and then within the census tract. So I wanted to see how many were actually within each census tract. So I summarized them, and you can see that compared to the previous figure, not all the census tracts within the county actually have that many contaminated sites. So I was kind of shocked when I first saw this, because I didn't think that there was going to be, I thought there was going to be more contaminated sites within each within each census tract. So the primary areas of contamination are in the eastern part of the county and the southern part of the county. So then I did this choropleth maps for each of the demographics as well. And you can see that this one is the poverty status, and this is the median household income, and then this is the African American population. So you can see that the poverty status and the median household income, the results were very similar. And then lastly was the bivariate choropleth maps that I summarized. So these are for poverty status and median household income, and they also have similar results. So you can see that there's not many areas where they both had high amounts of median, or the median household income was both high and the count of contaminated sites were both high. So this was not what I was expecting. I was expecting more areas to have high contaminated sites and high demographic. And then this is the last one, which is the African American population and the count of contaminated sites. So this one had a few more than the other two, but still not a strong relationship to conclude that the contaminated sites are more centered around certain demographics. So I wasn't able to conclude what I thought I was going to be able to from the beginning. So in conclusion, environmental injustice, community engagement, and future studies. So these were the three areas that I was kind of looking at to conclude on. And the main purpose of it was to be able to, maybe down the line, communicate with politicians and the community for them to better understand that, these areas of contamination are in their backyard, and understand whether or not that there's any environmental injustice based on the demographics. In future studies, I would like to, look at other demographics. So maybe, language that's spoken, the primary language of people, and look at maybe different demographics in that way. But really, I wasn't able to, conclude that there was a relationship between contaminated sites and demographics based on the demographics that I've chosen. And that's it.